thanks very much for the invitation, not least for the fact that I would have been at Brighton Magistrates Court this morning for the court appearance of Dominic Chappelle, the former owner of BHS. So thank you very much for having me here today. I mean, these are certainly interesting times, aren't they? I mean, I've never seen a news agenda quite like it. So what lies ahead for your industry and what's happening to the devolution agenda? That's the subject of this first panel. So firstly, a very warm welcome to Joe Anderson, on my right here, the Mayor of Liverpool City Council, the city's first directly elected mayor, who's long been a passionate defender of the city on the national stage. On my immediate right, Alex Ross-Shaw from Bradford City Council, who's the Cabinet Member for Regeneration. Now that empty chair, cutting it fine, but very good to see you. Sue Brown, Executive Director of London First, which represents some 300 businesses. It's aimed to make London the best city in the world in which to do business. And to my left, Savas Savuri, Chief Economist and Partner at the London hedge fund Tosca Fund, who's going to kick things off for us, maybe stir things up, with his take on the outlook ahead. So, Savas, take it away.
Good morning, and thank you for letting me have a chance to give my take on things. I want to split things into three sections. Before I talk about the present and then the future, let's go back in time. Because if you look back at a 12-month period, it's difficult to think of things going any worse or seemingly any worse than we've seen. We've had an election where the incumbent Prime Minister was looking to win a mandate because they occupied number 10 because of the departure of the previous Prime Minister. The election was contested and went to the wire. The opposition Labour Party had a Chancellor who was looking to push back the private sector and push in the public, renationalise. As we saw, the election led to a rather inconsequential outcome, and talk was of the Prime Minister not surviving barely 18 months and the government not getting through 5 years. In the same 12 months, we left a European Union superstructure that we were told to be economic disaster to do. That departure was sudden. The pound went down. We were forced to cut interest rates. The Chancellor was sacked. And we had terrorism darkening over London and more widely. Now, it does sound remarkably familiar. Those of you like me who are in their 50s will realise that it's happened twice, because what I've outlined happened in 1992. We left the RM, we were told it would be a disaster, the pound went down sharply, Norman Lamont was sacked. In the months before then, we had an election where John Smith was the prospective Chancellor and was almost as inclined in his views as John McDonnell. We had terrorism in London. I was working in the city when we were targeted twice. Now, I bring up 92 because the parallels are quite powerful, and we know that in the 5 years after those events of 92, we had GDP growing at 3% each year, unemployment went down, employment went up, consumer spending went up, there was no surge in inflation through the fall in interest rates. In fact, fall in the currency. In fact, by 1997, when John Major would lose to Tony Blair, having been the target of a stalking horse candidate, so John Major just managed to hold on for 5 years, but by 1997, the pound was back to where it was before we left the RM, and the economy had done remarkably well. Now, you might think that that was then, and this is now, and we're dealing with a completely different departure from a totally different European superstructure. I can't claim to have a crystal ball, but what I can argue is that the outcome of our negotiations won't be determined by Barnier and Davis. They're inconsequential. The people who will determine and guarantee that we have a soft exit, a soft Brexit, are not the people in the political corridors of power, but the people who run countries across Europe. Because no country in the EU 28 sits as centrally in the corporate lattice work, in the exchequer lattice work like the UK. let me just show you. This is an array of countries. These are our erstwhile EU partners. And here are there are four horizontals, capturing their exports to us and or earnings from UK businesses. Row 2 is our tourism into those countries, our expats in their countries, and their workers in the UK. And row 3 is investment that we've made into the EU27 and investments that have been made to us. No country in the EU28 has that many ticks. Germany is a net exporter, not a net importer. You may think this is some sort of subjective, questionable table. This is the data. These are the corporates. This is simply a subset. I've just tried to squeeze onto one A4 page a list of corporates who have significant earnings exposure from within the UK. And I'd like to point out Spain in particular. Those of you who travel in and out of Heathrow will know that may know it's owned by Ferrovial. Those of you who go shopping in Zara may or may know that it's owned by Inditex. Those of you who go to Spain on holiday will know that the hotels you're in are often owned by Melia. Those of you who know Abbey National in old money will know that it's now Santander. Those of you who know TSB in old money will know it's now owned by Banco Sabadell. Those of you who've got O2 phones will know that it's now owned by Telefonica. Now, those Spanish corporates are the largest in the IBEX 35. Whenever the pound goes down, whenever there's talk of a rustication, a hubristic rustication of the UK, the people who run those firms, I've been working in commercial finance for 26 years. I don't think of Spanish corporates by their corporate names. I think of them according to the families that even today, even though they're listed, own them. The Batan family who own Sabatel, the Ortega family that own Inditex, the families that own Telefonica and Melia, they are seeped in Spanish politics. And they'll be telling their politicos, who they fund, that a hard Brexit will hurt their earnings. And it will hurt their earnings and hurt their own pockets. And the same applies throughout Europe. If we go back to this table, and I'll show you some more data that defends this, only one country has no skin in the UK game. And you'll notice that one country is the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, which has a population of 500,000, barely the size of a medium-sized British city. A few more data points. This is our trade deficit with the EU. The Germans have a sustained trade surplus. These are the countries that systematically earn more from us than we earn from them. This is a graphic showing, this is national insurance data. This is the evolution of the number of national insurance numbers issued to EU nationals since 2002. And to give you an idea, doing a simple exercise in demographics, almost 30% of Lithuanian prime age adults have UK NI numbers. This is a graphic showing our tourism into the European Union, and this is showing you the numbers and the proportions of our nationals visiting these countries and spending freely there. This is the graphic showing the proportion of British expats representing the plus 50 population in countries like Ireland, Cyprus, Malta, and this is all justifying why this table exists. So, quite frankly, hard Brexit doesn't cause a crisis in the UK corporate sector as much as it causes a crisis within the economies of Spain, Ireland, Greece, Cyprus, Malta, Lithuania, Latvia. Game theory tells us that the people who run these countries aren't the short-dated, here-today, gone-tomorrow politicos or technocrats, but the families that run RWE, E.ON, EDF, the people who run Volkswagen, BMW, Daimler, the people that run the most powerful industrialists in Europe, is Carlos Ghosn, who runs Nissan Renault. Now, he's not concerned about the Renaults being exported to the UK that might be targeted by tariffs. What concerns him are the 500 plus thousand Nissans that are made in the Northeast that would be the target of tariffs. And that Nissan earnings profile has been why Renault have not been a poor performing auto company in Europe when otherwise they would have been. Now, the idea that somehow they can simply transplant their factory to France is absurd. The round trip costs of uprooting factories and relocating them, the costs in money and in time mean it's not going to happen. I'm not being overly sanguine. We will have a soft Brexit. Not because we're liked, not because somehow Davis and Boris Johnson bring out the charm, but because of self-interest. Now, let me just point to one other observation. Christian Barnier talks about the single market as having 4 pillars, and they're inviolate. You don't have all of them, you don't have any of them. If you ask an economist about the free movement of goods and services, they'll say it's the best thing possible. You ask an economist what they think about the free movement of labour, they'll say it depends. Is there an overarching tax system? Well, the European project put the cart before the horse. Having the free movement of labour when you haven't got an overarching tax system means that you get free riding and a race to the bottom. We've been benefiting from receiving dentists and nurses, plumbers and bricklayers from Europe that we haven't trained or educated, which means that the countries that we're getting them from have funded their education, their training, and we've got them for nothing. In reverse, we've been the target of the free riding of our health service. Why should European Union nations have an NHS of their own when they can simply, if one of their nationals is taken ill, give them a ticket to come to the UK? So if you want to have the free movement of labour as you have in the US, you need a federal tax system, and that never existed. That's never been proposed because it wouldn't be accepted. As for the free movement of money, great idea, unless you have different currencies and different interest rates. The reason that the Irish banks collapsed in the way they did, and the reason that the London property market had its boom bust the way it did, wasn't to do with subprime in the US, as much as the fact that you had Irish capital being carried into London cheap to fund Irish euros, into the London market, usurping sterling-funded debt and pushing the price of the Connaught Hotel and Claridge's and pushing up the price of prime asset after prime asset after prime asset. So when the pound went down sharply, as it did in 2008, because it's a free-moving currency, Irish banks called in their investors and said, or their loanees, can you refinance or recapitalise your loan? And they couldn't. So you had prime assets in London in a bad bank in Ireland because Christian Barnier thinks that the free movement of capital is a good idea. It's a great idea under a single currency structure. The free movement of labour is a great idea under a free movement, under a federal tax system. So let's stick with the free movement of goods and services. That was what made to you seem to be a bit of a diatribe by someone who was pro-Brexit. The most important thing about the global economy is that it extends beyond Europe. There's this sort of dysmorphia that we have. I'm not an isolationist. I'd probably smack Nigel Farage in the face if I saw him. I'm an internationalist, but I'm not a regionalist. And just to give you an idea of what I mean by regionalism and internationalism, I began studying economics in the mid-80s, and the country that was dynamic beyond all others in the Western world was Japan. And let me just show you Japan graphic in a global context. If you forgive me while I come through this. So this is coming up as a map. This is the world as as I knew it in the mid-80s. The red is effectively closed off. There was the Soviet Union, the red China. The black is what the European Union was back in 1984. Now look at Japan, how strongly it grew in the 60s and 70s and 80s, when the region it was sitting in was closed off. It engaged internationally with what was a rather small Western North Atlantic world. More recently, China has been on fire economically. And look at just how poorly Japan has benefited from its major regional partner growing at a rate that even it couldn't achieve during its halcyon days. Now, I make this observation because of all the countries around the world that China's been engaging with, few stand out more than the UK. And the UK isn't a target for China's capital because it likes London. It's been targeting Sheffield and Newcastle and Manchester. It's targeting Liverpool. It's targeting all of the UK. And this is just a simple factual representation of how the UK, alongside Japan and Germany, have been engaging with China. No country has come close to the UK in growing symbiotically with China. We have what it wants. We're in the right time zone. We have the language that it understands. We have a regulatory environment that it feels is neither too hot nor too cold. And it has also targeted us because it likes our universities. And you might want to consider this. The black line is the actual number of students from China into the UK currently in UK institutions. Normally when you forecast out to 2032, you'd think that it's a guess. Not when it comes to demographics, because the students who will be looking to come to study in the UK in 2032 have already been born, and they're progressing up to university age. And as they progress, they'll be enjoying the escalation in wealth that is being seen in China. So their families are moving up the income chain. By 2020, we can be fairly sure there's going to be a powerful inflection point in the number of students from China who come to the UK, who apply to the UK. And we need to build across the UK capacity to accommodate them. We need to build campus capacity, and we need to build capacity for them to live and leisure. It would be no exaggeration to say that the fastest growing industry in coming years in this country of education is incredibly accretive. It doesn't need natural resources, and it's incredibly well spread across the country. Here's a prediction for you, given we're in the northwest. At some point very soon, one of the space-constrained university colleges in London, whether it's King's, UCL, LSE, Imperial, will announce that it's building a new campus, not in London, which is space-constrained and expensive, but somewhere else. And it will target somewhere which is well-connected, that has already an established academic hub, and the Northwest, the Midlands will be targets. To give you the absurdity of what we've seen up to now, you've had the University of South Wales try to build a campus in London and fail. The University of East Anglia coming to London to build a campus, when in reality, what you'll see is a centrifugal movement from London out to the regions. And universities are incredibly land intensive. You can't run universities over weekends. You can't run universities through a night shift. They want land, and students that are going to come to the UK won't be working at Starbucks or or working as shop assistants. They'll be shopping, because to come here from Asia, principally China, will not be cheap. And to give you an idea, that surge in Chinese students coming to the UK is not my imagination. We know that every year, by and large, there are about 17 million births in China. And we know every year in China, about 10% of the middle class becomes ultra middle class. And that means they can afford to come to study overseas. And the UK is their target. Currently, 1/3 of students in Australia are Chinese. So we need to basically do two things. We need to become much more accommodating in our visas to Chinese, and Indian students, and also remove students from the number of migrants that have been recorded. I've got nothing against the Maltese or Croatians, but once we leave the European Union, we can start to have a much more expansive policy on immigration. So rather than prejudice the Canadians against the Croatians, give them a fair crack of the whip. Rather than prejudice the Malaysians against the Maltese, give them both a fair crack of the whip. This is not about bringing migration down. It's about making migration much more broadly based. So just to finish off with the China story, and the China story is the only story that matters. This is a representation of where China has invested since 2005 around the world. And you'll see that since 2005, the UK is the single biggest destination, single most significant destination of China's investment. This is what happened in 2016 alone, this year of change and trauma. And this is why, not least, forget sterling euro, forget sterling dollar. China has seen its purchasing power into our country rise dramatically from 2008 and again over more recent years, which is why they are buying up and buying around the UK. The bolded acquisitions have happened since the referendum. Okay? So this is a country that isn't frivolous, it's game-changing. There's never been a China on the global stage ever before. Okay? 1.3 billion people run by a central power that is a juggernaut economy. Forget India, this is the place that matters. And this is an example of where the money's going. It's spread widely across the country. The first five-star hotel in Sheffield is being funded by the Chinese. They're funding the high-speed rail link. They're trying to fund our power system. Do I care about their money coming here? Do I feel fearful that we're going to be overrun by them? No. It doesn't bother me in the least, and it shouldn't bother you. And I'll leave with one anecdote, if I may. We're told that somehow there's going to be a crisis in London because we won't be given passporting rights or equivalents. Back in February of this year, the railway franchise that was operated by National Express into Fenchurch Street, that those of you who know Fenchurch Street will know it lives and dies on the city. It goes straight into the insurance district, and that train, Monday to Friday, is occupied by only people practically who work in finance, banking and insurance. In February, National Express sold that franchise very lucratively to Trenitalia. Trenitalia, as the name suggests, is an Italian train operator. What makes Trenitalia interesting is it's owned by the Italian state. And the underbidder for that franchise was Abellio. And Abellio is a Dutch train operator owned by the Dutch state. So you've got the Italian state currently owning a rail franchise that will be badly hit by a hard Brexit. The Dutch government felt hard done by that it didn't win that franchise, and yet we're supposed to believe that the political classes in Europe will go for a hard Brexit. Actions speak louder than words. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Savas. So basically, don't panic, Mr. Mannering. Joe, what do you think? Do you share Savas's optimism about what lies ahead?
Well, I enjoyed the presentation. There's a great deal of the comments I agree with. There's a few that I have different views about. I enjoyed the presentation, especially the bit where you mentioned Nigel Farage. That was quite good. And I texted him and get somebody to get a helicopter and bring him up here so I could watch you slap him. But in reality, I think the issue around the point about politicos against businesses making the decision on whether we have a soft or hard Brexit. Whilst I accept your point about the lobbying and strength of businesses in trying to persuade governments and indeed the 27 members that it's damaging to them. of course, they'll be wanting to protect themselves as well, and not just the UK, as important, it is to investors. I think what worries me is, of course, is that the businesses and the people that are concerned about Brexit just have one vote. I'm talking about, business themselves, and ordinary people have a vote too. So the politicos do take notice of what they think, and that's the point about, in some of the most deprived wards, not just in this city, but in the country, people have a view that the European Union is at fault for lack of investment in education, lack of investment in health, lack of investment in jobs and training and opportunities, and they equate Europe to that, and that's unfortunate. So I do have a concern about the politicos versus businesses who could decide whether we get a soft or a hard Brexit. I think in relation to the comments you made about China, in relation to the emerging parts of the world which wants to internationalise, like India, like China, it's up to cities like Liverpool, whether in or out, to make and take advantage of that, which we do. And I think, coming back to about what we do as a city, a lot of it has to not wait for the outcomes of Brexit and the negotiations, but very much promote the opportunities that exist inside and outside the European Union. So, we'll get on with doing that. But I think around 80% of what was said in the presentation, I concur with, but with some exceptions.
Alex, how do you see things from Bradford? Is there much Chinese money going into Bradford? What's the outlook from your city?
Not as much as we'd like, I'd guess. Yeah, we've looked enviously over at some of our neighbours who've done quite well. But I think with the scale of the investment that China looks for, we know that sometimes it's easy through the city region probably, so we know that Leeds City region, obviously with Bradford representation, went out to visit China to try drum up that interest, but you need such a large economy of scale for the packages that they'd need to invest in. Just as an individual city, it's probably a bit harder really, but I'm feeling a bit more optimistic about Brexit after that now. So, the worry from local authorities, I think, is that obviously money that did come through to us from the EU directly, now we need to have that debate with government about where that money goes. So what we don't want to see is it go down to London and then shifted out to different areas, so that somehow Yorkshire or the city region or Liverpool or anywhere loses out. So that's probably one of the big debates we're having on Brexit at the moment.
And Sue, what's your take? What on the outlook? Do you share Savis's optimism?
Yeah, I do actually. I'm from London First, which is the business lobby organisation for London, and I think 2 or 3 points to make. One is that as London First, actually dealing with Brexit and the implications of Brexit has become our main priority. And it's especially our main priority in relation to talent, and that's talent right across the board. Clearly, the London economy, not the UK economy, but the London economy is so dependent on EU nationals that's actually now, at the moment, our number one priority is making sure that EU nationals are, treated fairly, that people can remain in London. And I think that's the first thing. The second thing is we are called London First, but currently the biggest programme we're running is an outreach programme to make sure that actually it's not just about London, but it's about the other major cities in the UK. And that's, if Brexit, dealing with the implications of Brexit is our number one priority, our next priority is making sure that it's not just about what London gets and what other people don't get, but that actually making sure that government knows that, we need Crossrail 2, but equally, we need HS3 and all those sorts of things. So we're badly named. We've actually sort of had quite a lot of discussions recently about whether or not we should change our name to not be London First any longer. And we're sticking with it, but basically we're very much about dealing with the implications of Brexit in relation to talent and making sure that we're working with the other major cities throughout the UK.
So the government is fair to say, very preoccupied right now. You've got the civil servants bound up with Brexit, the Grenfell response. The Conservatives are in this post-election mess with manoeuvrings going on. Just look at the last few days. The question is devolution on the back burner? Joe?
Yeah, the honest answer to that is yes. I think it is. You know, the fact of the matter is that whether we like it or whether we don't, there is, since George Osborne, whether he was sacked or whatever, clearly, you know, he was the prime mover of devolution along with Cameron. That's very much, to me, as took now a backseat. And you're right that a lot of things have happened that mean that the focus of government is on delivering and also fighting within itself around how it's going to portray the Brexit negotiations, how it's dealing with, you know, investments, infrastructure investment, whether it's the Midlands Edging, the Northern Powerhouse and stuff. So devolution has, you know, took a back seat. Somebody asked me yesterday around, you know, how I would describe it, and I said, well, it's a bit, you know, I'm a great believer in using analogies to describe things, that as a simple way. And I guess it's like, you know, going through a lot of pain to have all your teeth taken out to get a brand new set of dentures, going through all of that pain, getting there and only being able to manage a bottom set without a top set of teeth. That's how it feels. Quite simply, that's how it feels. You know, we've got some things in place, but nowhere near given powers or fiscal powers, fiscal devolution to cities to enable it to do things. You know, one of the great things about devolution is it allows cities to do much, much more for themselves, to sustain themselves, and to create a better economic balance across the country, and not just focused and centralised on London. You know, and if we're not getting those powers and that fiscal devolution, fiscal responsibility, then we're not going to be able to do things. If you look at, you know, the likes of this particular facility that you're in today, this is a decision that I made to build. We own it, the city, along with the arena and the convention centre, the exhibition centre and the hotel. And we've done that in a strategy of invest to earn, so that we can stimulate growth and bring business and bring people and tourists and people in to support businesses in the city. That's the type of thing that often goes unrecognised, what local authorities or what mayors or what leaders do. And we want the ability to do much, much more of that, because I want a city that's sustainable and not dependent on central government, but the ability to actually grow our economy. And you know, devolution, when we talk about the Northern Powerhouse, is a fundamental part of the powerhouse. And without devolution, the powerhouse is a house without electricity or a roof. You need both, and that's, I think, what Osborne got. But unfortunately, I think Theresa May wants to ditch anything that Osborne had his hands on, unfortunately.
Alex, do you think, I mean, given the austerity that we've had these last few years, that the cynics would say, look, the government's just deftly delegated its responsibilities to Labour politicians at a local level, washed its hands of the problems, and now the Northern Powerhouse is going to wither on the vine?
Yeah, I don't think we ever thought Labour politicians would be pining for the days of George Osborne, to be honest. But yeah, there is a definite mood change there. Yeah, I mean, since they came in, obviously, you call it devolving the axe sort of thing. They did extra cuts to local authorities and left us to deal with it, because they know that the political swing is when you're in power, you tend to lose your local authority seats and vice versa. So Eric Pickles saw the way the wind was going, probably, and did additional cuts onto local authorities. But that is exactly why we need devolution, as Joe said, to be honest, because a place like Bradford, where we're losing all the central government funding, You know, the city region growth deal in Leeds is starting to run out, but we need that funding. So cities like Bradford really need devolution going forward, and that's why we're very keen on it. The question is, does the government have the bandwidth really with Brexit? I actually kind of think politically though, they're going to want to show they can deliver something other than Brexit. They won't want to just be, if you're a politician in charge of devolution or Northern Powerhouse or whatever, you don't want to just be known as delivering Brexit and being succeeding or failing just on that. So I actually think there will be some desire, it's just whether they can get something out the door. But certainly in Bradford and Leeds City region, we're very keen on more devolution as a way of allowing local authorities to invest and prosper.
So we've got councils progressing at different speeds. On city deals, the combined authorities, elected mayors. Could the both of you just give us an update? I think a lot of people in this room would like to know, what does devolution, given the more limited bandwidth, what does it mean for economic growth, investment in property, infrastructure? Can you just lay out how you think things are going to go for both your cities?
Well, the devolution process, in terms of if we go back, you know, 5-6 years when the development agencies were ditched as a model, and there was an introduction of the LEPs, the local enterprise partnerships. What central government needed was, in additionality to having the private sector, which I hugely welcome, being involved in the decision-making process, they needed an accountable body system, and that's what the combined authorities were set up to run alongside the LEPs. And you know, they work really well. As I said, I passionately believe that the private sector working with the public sector is the best way of delivering growth and understanding what the picture is about what needs to be done. If you look, for instance, at the single investment fund, which is the regional growth fund, together with the gain share, money that's been devolved to local authorities. In the Liverpool City region, for instance, we've used around about 173 million of single investment fund, single growth fund money, to lever in about 470 million of private sector investment. And that's, you know, infrastructure improvements, but also supporting businesses to grow and sustain themselves moving forward. And it also means that local authorities within the region actually work together to look at that macro picture rather than an individual picture. So it does work, and the model is the right model because it's that agglomeration of wealth and power and brains and stuff that actually can make things work. So, you know, it has had success. My argument is that, you know, you can see that, government can see that. So why not actually take a punt and allow more devolution, more fiscal responsibility, so that we can grow our economy together, working with the private sector in the regions to create more jobs, some more sustainability. And actually, to, you know, one of the things that I always say to people around this not being as a power grab for people, I want the UK's economy to be strong. I want the UK's economy to actually be supportive of each other. And it is about then having economic prosperity across the whole UK. It's that phrase about balancing the UK's economy. And by giving city regions like Liverpool, an economic powerhouse in itself, the front door to the Northern Powerhouse, the ability to grow, it means that there's more income, more GVA for the UK as a whole, not just for the Liverpool region. So it's dead simple, really. Release the shackles and allow regions to grow and prosper.
So Alex, how do you unlock growth in Bradford? And can you touch on how do we overcome this north-south divide, which is all about productivity at the heart of it and low skills as well?
Yeah, well, Northern Powerhouse Rail will help, so we'll gladly take London First support for that. So Bradford's very keen to have a city centre stop for Bradford and Northern Powerhouse Rail, but infrastructure is a a huge bit. For Bradford, two of our key priorities are skills and connectivity, really, where we've got poor infrastructure, we've had low levels of investment in it. Obviously, there's lots of stats about how the North's had much lower levels of investment than the South, Yorkshire even lower than the Manchester side as well. But when we're talking about Northern Powerhouse Rail, one of the debates we're having is that the traditional Treasury model of looking at infrastructure projects favours the South inherently, because you get a lot more value for money on that because of the scale of London. So Crossrail will deliver much more benefits from a Treasury Minister looking at it, or a civil servant, than Northern Powerhouse Rail. So we've really got to have that debate about, if you want to redress the balance between North and South, you need to kind of look at the added value of infrastructure projects, maybe over a longer term, and just look at it differently so that you can get those infrastructure projects in, because at the moment you've just had decades of underinvestment. And it's how we turn that around. And for a place like Bradford, as I say, without that, we're going to struggle to overcome it.
So Sue, London and the South is hogging all the money.
Well, I mean, as I hope I've just said, clearly, you know, Crossrail 1, Crossrail opens next year. We'll be celebrating that. We genuinely think that we have to have Crossrail 2. But as I say, we're not playing the game anymore if it's either or. We think, you know, government has to invest in Crossrail 2, but equally, as I say, it has to invest in the North as well. I mean, one thing I would say, and this is not official London First policy, but the thing about George Osborne coming away from the Northern Powerhouse and going to the Standard, there is a view in London that he did that because he saw what being Mayor of London did for Boris. So, you know, the more cynical amongst us will think that. But yeah, no, as I say, we think it's, you know, has to be investment in the North and in the South.
It's definitely not an either or, by the way, as well. You know, we're very keen, you know, with London powers. London succeeds, Britain succeeds, and we get that. It's just about rebalancing that investment. So.
Well, that's definitely the point, isn't it? You know, London has to succeed, but the major cities have to succeed as well. It's not either or. It's, and as I say, you know, we've just had a very big debate about whether we change the name, because, you know, London First is not something we particularly want to be seen as doing. We think it needs infrastructure all over.
So Joe, you were talking there about we need more fiscal devolution, and we're going to have this big shift in 2020, aren't we, when you've got 100% retention of business rates. I'd like to ask you and Alex how you think all that is going to work. What difference is this going to make? What are you going to be doing?
Well, it's clearly a step in the right direction that we can retain business rates to invest, if that's how government want to do it. But there are inequalities in the system if we're allowing the business rates retention to be the only funding mechanism that supports cities, because, you know, we talk about London, but there's a big difference between Kensington in London and Kensington in Liverpool. You know, one is one of the most deprived wards in the country, and the other one is one of the most affluent. And the business rates from that is more than we get in tax and business rates in 5 years. They get in, I think, a 3-month or a month period. So there's a big difference. So it's a step in the right direction. It means that we can, you know, plan ahead, and it's right to incentivise cities to grow their economy, because the more businesses we have, the more ability we have to raise taxes. But, you know, we need to be able to support businesses to grow. We need to be able to do things, and so it is about getting that balance of investment right for us to actually grow the economy, create more businesses, enabling us to get more business rates in. But that can't be the only fiscal devolution. You know, we want, and I would like to see more in the way of you know, VAT or other taxes ring-fenced or top sliced to give back to cities to be able to do things with. And that's, you know, we're the most over-centralised government in the world in terms of tax retention, and I think we've got to do more with that and be a bit more innovative, because, you know, what we want is to incentivise business growth, and for, you know, I believe Liverpool as a city And I try not to use the words council anymore. We use the words Liverpool City as probably, I hope, one of the most entrepreneurial cities, working alongside business to help and stimulate growth within the city, and we need to do much, much more of that. And that's why, I've set up Myrtle Development Zones. We've got our own system of supporting business through the Myrtle Development Fund, and that's the type of thing that we need to do, because it's that invest to earn strategy that is going to help us sustain ourselves moving forward, and being able to help us provide the services that people need and want within the city moving forward.
A lot of people might suspect that 100% business rates retention will just incentivise councils to introduce more floor space to get more revenue instead of dealing with some of the intractable problems that you've got. I mean, presumably in Bradford, you need to drive land values up to generate more rates.
Yeah, actually, yeah. The two big areas we need to be more financially sustainable is grow business rates and grow council tax base, actually, and land viability is a big issue for both of them, and that's partly actually why those growth deals from devolution is so important, because that provides the public funding to bridge that viability gap, which is a huge problem for us. On business rates, we know in Bradford, for instance, we're below average in our business rate collection and growth, and therefore that affects our ability to provide services to the public, really, which is ultimately what we're about as a council. But in Bradford, we had a problem where business rates were considered quite high for the sort of retail offer of the city as well. So we introduced a growth scheme, which is a Revo award-winning growth scheme, actually, to introduce business rebates, business rate rebates linked to job creation and bringing vacant units back into use, and that's worked really well. But certainly when the business rate review came through, we were hoping for it to be a bit better for Bradford than it was. So you still got that viability gap.
So how big a lever is that for you to pull in 2020, the business rates retention?
Well, it is important for us because it was part of the kind of deal with government that they're going to end the central government grants, and therefore the council will be half the size it was, but you'll have business rate retention. So the worry for councils was always a bit like Joe intimated with the two Kensingtons, but places with really high business rate retention would rub their hands together. No, that's great, because previously some of that would be sliced out to be redistributed. A place like Bradford, we'd anticipate that we could lose out from that, but ultimately we do want that fiscal autonomy. You've got to make sure that cities like Bradford don't lose out from it.
It's important that people understand and know the complexity of local government finance and how it works. If we, as a city like Bradford or many of the core cities, for instance, are dependent on rate support grants to help us support things that need to be done within the city, if that in its entirety is being taken away, you've got to make sure that the other rates that you get in, the council tax, the business rates, are equivalent to that. Otherwise, you will have to cut or make reductions in services, and that's where some local authorities are at. They will simply not. They will have a huge gap. Some, 60, 70 million, some beyond that. In terms of making up that gap between what they get with rate support grant. And in 2020, as that's removed, it will cause a massive problem and a massive headache for people. And that's a reality that government yet doesn't understand. And that's why, we need a floor mechanism, a protection mechanism, a blanket that supports some of the poorest areas, enabling them to catch up. As I say, business rates in parts of London are 4 times what we receive in totality in Liverpool, and they get that in a quarter. So we've got to expect or demand a view or a decision from government that recognises that.
So time's ticking on. I want to try and get to a few questions from the floor, but I want to move on to a live issue now for a lot of people in the room. Joe, you touched on investing to earn, but I know councils have got to be creative about getting new sources of income, but is it right that councils should be buying shopping centres? Is that the best use of public money for councils, to be buying shopping centres, car parks, business parks? Joe?
Well, I mean, look, I personally believe that you know, we've got to make sure that we don't replace business, but we assist business and we support business, and that's the invest to earn approach that we've done. I mean, as I said, if you look at where we are today in this building and this complex with the hotel, the arena and convention centre next door, you know, we don't make huge profit from that, but does it support the Liverpool economy? It's supported the Liverpool economy over the last 10 years by £1 billion. And they're not my figures, they're independent figures. So it shows that that invest to earn model works. But if you look at, for instance, whether we build a car park, as long as, you know, we don't frighten people away from coming to that car park, which is next to a shopping district, then it's the right thing to do. Indeed, that's why we need to do it, to try and attract more people to those shopping districts and those shopping centres. So I listen to businesses and I work with businesses, and I'm not anti-business. I'm very, very much pro-business, because, you know, without growth, I'm a pragmatic person, and I understand that if you don't earn money, you can't spend it. And it's dead simple. And so we've got to work with businesses, because they are the lifeblood of our city, the small businesses included, that employ people within our city. And I want to make sure that they do. So we're not replacing. You know, I've used, for instance, our freeholds to give to businesses so they can actually borrow money. I've used grants in the Mayoral Fund that brings old buildings back into use that are run as either hotels or other businesses. So it's that type of intervention that we do that is pro-business, not anti-business. So, you know, I give that clear message to businesses in this city, and we have a great relationship with businesses in this city, and I want to do more to stimulate business growth and help businesses survive and grow stronger. It's no good having new businesses coming in and opening if Indigenous business or businesses that have been here for 20 years are closing. We've got to try and work together to grow and protect what we've got.
Sue, do you think it's a bit anti-competitive that Joe and Alex can borrow at rates far cheaper than the market?
No, I don't. I've got problems with my mic. No, I don't actually. I mean, I think, you know, in London, I mean, Joe's talking about, you know, Park Kensington and Liverpool not being the same as Kensington in London. What I would point out, of course, is Grenfell happened in Kensington. Mm-hmm. So, you know, we do have extremes of, you know, great wealth and great deprivation in London as well. But no, I think that local authorities have to do what they have to do to enable growth. And certainly I do lots and lots of work with the GLA, and there are places in London, some of which, it's not working, sorry, it's still not working, some of which, you know, places do regenerate just as on the basis of private sector. But there's other places in London where we really do need to intervene to bring about change. So no, I don't have any problem with it at all.
And Alex, what do you say to some investors who think, hang on a minute, this is an accident waiting to happen? There was an extraordinary stat from Savills that something like 40% of all transactions on shopping centres and secondary centres were down to local authorities in the last year. I mean, that's extraordinary, isn't it? Have you bought any shopping centres?
Well, yeah, funny you mentioned car parks and shopping centres, actually. No, I don't think we've bought any shopping centres. I think we have some historically, though. And we just adopted an investment strategy which talks about all these things, actually, funnily enough, so very timely. We've just bought an NCP car park in the last year, actually. But I think there's a bit of a perception in terms of whether it's a good use of money or not, is that we can borrow against the revenue we'd get from that and then generate some profit on top of that, and that helps pay for services. But it's about the risk appetite of the council in terms of how it wants to view those investments. But for us in Bradford, for instance, we've taken an option on a building to purchase it on a key shopping street that's where the retail core's now shifted. So there's a lot more vacant units there, so we're looking at relocating our markets there. And that's really a strategic acquisition that will hopefully generate revenue, but also act as a key anchor tenant in a regeneration project that will help stimulate private sector investment, because they know that there's a local authority there and a key tenant there with, for the foreseeable future. So I think you've got to be careful in how you approach it, and you've got to make sure you've got your risk right. But I do think it's inevitable if you're going to reduce councils' funding and say you need to be more entrepreneurial, then they're inevitably going to look at utilising their sort of procurement strengths and economy of scale and start acquiring assets as well.
Can I just give you one example of why it's right to do and right to work, as long as it's not allowed to be too much of a gamble, and that is to do things outside of your own districts. But if we look at the building that Liverpool City Council purchased 2 years ago, it's called the Cunard building. It's one of the three Graces. If you walk along the waterfront, you'll see it. I paid £10.4 million for it. It's now worth around about £28 million. And what it's done is, not only is it protected a listed building, it's incentivised other people to come to the waterfront in the buildings next to it and invest in those buildings. And now we've secured thousands of jobs there. And that shows you that the right investment, doing the right thing, is the right thing to do. And it's just about stimulating, helping and support. One thing that Liverpool is asset rich but revenue poor. And so I've got to try and address that, as you would as business people, addressing your shortfalls, and that's exactly what I'm doing. And some people shouldn't criticise us for trying to get more revenue in, as long as it doesn't disadvantage the private sector, and that's the difference.
We're so out of time, but let me just quickly ask the audience, stick your hands up in the air if you think it's right that local authorities should be snapping up commercial assets to the extent that they are, in order, not for stewardship, but simply to get a return. Stick your hands up if you think it's the right thing to do. Okay, I think that's not a bad show. I will take a quick question or two briefly. If anyone's got a burning question they'd like to ask, we've got to be quick though. No? Okay, well that will round things up. Thank you so much to our panel. I think we've touched on a lot of points there. All to play for seems to be the mood here. So who knows what the next few years will bring, but there's a lot of optimism from the panel. So thank you all so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.